I can sum up my views on Sonia Sotomayor by saying this. If Kamala Harris were nominated to the Supreme Court and somehow got confirmed by the Senate, she probably wouldn't be the dumbest person on the court. I recall watching the Sotomayor confirmation hearings back in 2009 and thinking to myself, in a nation of 306.8 million people, this person is the finest legal mind that the president could find for this spot. This person, who impresses me as someone I probably wouldn't trust to run a fast food restaurant for 12 hours, is someone who warrants a lifetime appointment to the uppermost echelon of American jurisprudence? Like, seriously? Now, remember the Harriet Miers nomination back in 2005 when George W. Bush decided it would be a lovely idea to put his personal lawyer on the Supreme Court? And the news media, of course, had a week-long orgy of performative outrage over how screamingly unqualified she was, and they weren't wrong about that part. She was screamingly unqualified. But having said that, as legal minds go, Sonia Sotomayor makes Harriet Miers look like Oliver Wendell Holmes or John Marshall. So, you may have heard, or just heard about it, when during oral arguments the other day on the constitutionality of Joe Biden's unconstitutional vax mandate, Justice Sotomayor casually remarked that there are 100,000 children currently hospitalized on ventilators with the great communist Chinese Wuhan Kung Flu coronavirus of 2019, brought to you with limited commercial interruptions by His Holiness Dr. Anthony Fauci, patron saint of throat lozenges, malignant narcissism, and unwittingly helping your geopolitical adversary build deadly bioweapons. And she was close to having the number right. After all, she only overstated the number of hospitalizations by a factor of 96%. We all miss here and there sometimes, right? Since the actual number is 4,000, not 100,000, and the number hospitalized for COVID is, of course, a mere fraction of that, because the 4,000 is the number of under 18 hospital patients who have tested positive for the virus. So if a kid fell off his skateboard and snapped an ankle and he tests positive for asymptomatic COVID when he gets to the hospital, he is in the 4,000. And as far as the thing about ventilators, it's anybody's guess which bodily orifice she pulled that whopper out of, but out here in the real world, where the Omicron variant is so well tolerated in young people that most of them never know they even had it, the number of kids in hospitals who are unable to breathe on their own and are intubated right now due to the Rona, that number is almost certainly zero. But here we are, living in a world where Supreme Court justices have the mentality of your garden variety dumbass internet troll. And they don't bother making any pretense about the fact that they are partisan operators whose job is to invent tortured rationales for conferring the imprimatur of constitutionality onto whatever their party and their party's president try to do. Sonia Sotomayor is a loyal Democrat. She is in the position she occupies precisely because she is a loyal Democrat, and for no other reason. And as long as there's a Democrat president in office, she will contort herself into whatever legally incoherent pretzel shapes are required in order to vindicate the policies that the Joe Biden regime attempts to ram down on the American people. And it's things like that that separate the right from the left. Case in point, this thing that happened with Ted Cruz last week is also a good object lesson in the difference between the two. So Ted Cruz the other day in committee, for reasons that are as unknown as they are incomprehensible, referred to the Capitol riot of January 6th as a violent terrorist attack, which it most assuredly was not. It wasn't a terrorist attack any more than it was an insurrection, because terrorist attacks and insurrections typically don't involve the unarmed perpetrators wandering around, taking selfies, and high-fiving each other. So Ted Cruz says this silly, stupid thing, and what happens? Well, everybody on the right calls him out for it. They say, Ted Cruz, you said a stupid thing. In fact, this is the stupidest thing you've said since you grew the beard, frankly, and we're extremely disappointed in you. Now, contrast that with what happens when somebody on the left goes off message or contravenes the prevailing leftist orthodoxy of the day. Do the other people on the left call him out for it? Of course they don't. They immediately circle up the wagons and they go into damage control mode, and they spend at least 2 or 3 days explaining how the person's words were taken out of context, or that's not what they really meant to say. This is what they really meant to say. Speaking of which, The recently deceased former Nevada Senator Harry Reid will be lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda next week, where tributes will be paid by all manner of Democrat Party luminaries, including, of course, President Joe Biden and former President Barack Obama. So, to put it another way, Barack Obama is going to be sitting in a room listening to a man who once described him as the first black candidate who's clean and articulate and a nice-looking guy, paying tribute to a man who once said he was a good candidate because he's light-skinned and doesn't speak in a Negro dialect. And remember, this is the party of the non-racists. These are the same people who don't hesitate to call Donald Trump a xenophobic white supremacist for using terms like Mexican judge or Chinese flu, but they always circle those wagons, and it's what gives them a competitive advantage, even when their policies are indefensible country-wrecking madness that has no broad-based support among the general population. Now hit the music, Jim Eagle, because I want to talk about the Washington Admirals and Insurrectapalooza 2022. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where I once met a Mexican judge with the Chinese flu who spoke in a Negro dialect. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the Saturday Special. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And I need to start first by apologizing for my absence yesterday. I had a hockey game that sneaked up on me all of a sudden. I had totally slipped my mind until I got the text reminder around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But when they've postponed the last 6 games in a row, one tends to lose track of the schedule fairly quickly, and especially at my advanced age. So the Washington Redskins have a new nickname, apparently, at least if this Twitter leak is to be believed, which will replace their current non-existent nickname. And over the past couple of years, I've read a few pieces where potential names for new names for the team were being bandied about, and the general assumption seemed to be, and it was an assumption I tended to agree with, that they would choose something that was partially homonymic with the previous name, like they did in Cleveland when they switched from Indians to Guardians. So it seemed most likely that Washington would replace Redskins with Red something or other. Like Red Tails was a candidate that I often heard come up. But you know what didn't ever come up? Admirals. But if these leaks and rumors are accurate, that is what they are actually switching to. Washington Admirals, which not only doesn't sound good, but it's totally nonsensical. There is no major naval installation in Washington, D.C. Washington is not a Navy town. It's never been a Navy town. The only admirals in Washington have desk jobs at the Pentagon. But I'll tell you who's really loving this is Admiral Hunter Biden, America's greatest naval hero, Nelson on the Delaware, who released a TikTok video wherein he expressed, while being stark naked and between doing rails of coke off a stripper's boobs, his gratitude for the team's choice to rename itself in his honor. But here's a serious question, and it's one that no one ever bothers asking. Has the life of any American Indian been materially improved by the Washington Redskins no longer being called the Washington Redskins? Is any person going to prosper in any measurable way by memory holding 80-plus years of Native American imagery and replacing it with naval imagery? Or is this sort of stuff just done so that self-loathing white liberals can have an excuse to feel morally virtuous? But who knows? Maybe I'm getting it all wrong. Maybe the real purpose is to honor the proud nautical tradition of our various Indian tribes. Admiral Sitting Bull, Captain Geronimo, Lieutenant Commander Crazy Horse, they all did some of their finest work out on the high seas. Young Indian braves used to look forward all year to that special day when the tribal council would announce it was time to weigh anchor and sail on to the next port. All aboard the SS Lakota, ye scallywags, we sail at dawn! But you know what? It takes real conviction for an NFL team to adopt a name so stupid it's never been used on this continent except by the occasional minor league hockey team. Hell, the team I root for, the San Diego Gulls, actually used to be the Norfolk Admirals, and a former iteration of the San Diego Gulls, the team that wore these lovely colors right here, they used to play against the Milwaukee Admirals back in the IHL. And speaking of things and people who belong in the minor leagues, Kamala Harris gave a speech on Thursday morning to kick off the festivities for Insurrectapalooza 2022. which the Democrats are, of course, feverishly trying to establish as some sort of new national holiday. And I'm sorry, pardon me, I did not get her introduction right. I meant to say, from the mean streets of Jim Crow Montreal, currently fighting out of Washington, D.C., an artist who needs no introduction the world over, the one and only California cackler herself, Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris! Now, the thing about this speech that has received the most notice is the fact that she came right out of the gate and opened with a direct comparison and equivalency between the silly Capitol riot and Pearl Harbor and 9/11. Because, those three events are all basically the same thing, right? But that wasn't the thing that struck me about this speech, because they've been using that same disgustingly overwrought hyperbole to refer to January 6th practically since the day it happened. It's hardly even noteworthy at this point, really. It's par for the course, if anything. The thing that struck me was just how incredibly bad this person is at public speaking, and how she seems to actually be getting worse at it. This speech was so badly delivered, I felt like I was listening to a person in a Toastmasters class who's just starting out trying to learn the rudiments of speaking in public and isn't really doing all that well with it. The same cadences, the same pauses, in the exact same places, the same pattern of modulation in every single sentence. I haven't heard this many pauses since Howard Cosell passed away. Can they not get this woman some media training or something? And granted, she's starting out with a fairly serious handicap because she has a natural manner of speaking that inherently comes off as smug and condescending and unlikable. But my God, get this woman some help. Send her to an actual Toastmasters class in disguise. It couldn't hurt anything. But when you've got a vice president who evinces no particular skills or talents or expertise of which to speak, who manages to be useless in a job where very little is required of her to begin with, despite somehow having been a state attorney general and a United States senator, it seems like a good time to ask, have we taken affirmative action hiring now to its maximally absurd endpoint, when you can fail upward all the way to being one beat of Joe Biden's 136-year-old heart away from the presidency just because you're a woman who happens to have two non-white parents? And is that the sort of country in which any sane person actually wants to live? Because, spoiler alert, the answer is no. There is no sane person who thinks societies become better places when positions of inscrutable power are handed to people who have done nothing to earn them. There is no sane person who thinks representation is more important than competence. There is no sane person who thinks giving important jobs to thoroughly unqualified people strengthens the moral fabric of the nation. So the vice president finishes her interminable little presentation, and then it was the president's turn to do his 10 minutes of angry mumbling. And this address of his was unlike anything I've ever seen before in terms of a sitting president just launching a broadside of insults and personal attacks against a former president. Because I'm sure glad we have Joe Biden in the White House now to be the uniter, the ecumenicalist, the guy who's going to turn down the temperature of the political discourse and bring us all back together. That is how this guy sold himself during the campaign. It's how his handlers sold him. It's how the fake news media sycophants sold him. Joe Biden was going to be the guy who returned dignity and civility to the presidency. The only problem with that plan is this old codger continues to demonstrate that he's a nearly 80-year-old man who has the mentality of a high school bully. He's saying all these horrible things about Trump, just sneering and mocking the night away, and the tenor, the tone of what he's saying, it sounds exactly like Biff Tannen trying to torment George McFly in Back to the Future. I think Joe Biden, in his heart of hearts, is the bigger kid who jams his finger into the chest of the smaller kid and says, "What's the matter, sissy? You gonna cry, sissy? You wanna cry, don't you, sissy?" Except in this case, he's jamming his finger into Donald Trump's chest, saying, "You lost the election, sissy. You're a defeated ex-president, sissy. Aren't you embarrassed? You lost by 7 million votes, sissy. What, are you gonna cry? I bet you wanna cry." And he, of course, has a long track record of displaying this same mentality, of attempting to humiliate people who get on his bad side, like when a voter asks him a tough question in a town hall and Biden mocks the guy for being overweight, or when he's asked a question about why black people should vote for him, and he responds by telling the guy, "You ain't black," or when he remarks about wanting to take someone out behind the gym and beat their ass. People in their late 70s do not talk that way. This is schoolyard-level male insecurity. It's juvenile adolescent behavior that normal people leave behind when they reach their 20th birthday, at the latest. And speaking of things normal people don't do, normal people don't go out of their way to take political metaphors and make them be literally true. But after the president and the vice president were done with their respective cringe-inducing addresses the other morning, it was time for that noted entertainment impresario Nancy Pelosi to take over the conductor's podium, and it was then that figurative political theater became actual political theater, complete with the requisite song and dance number, which was supplied by the cast of the Hamilton Broadway show under the direction of Lin-Manuel Miranda, whom Nancy Pelosi introduced as one of the greatest musical composers of the current epoch, before immediately getting his name wrong. That's an outstanding look, Nance. It's like, I am such a huge fan of this man's work, except I don't have the faintest idea how to pronounce his name, but never mind that. She said the first name as Lin-Manuel, when even I know he pronounces it Lin-Manuel, and then somehow she even managed to stumble over the Miranda part. And then some stupid people start singing some stupid song on a Zoom call. I don't know who the intended target audience for this is. I don't know what the desired effect of it is supposed to be, but there is one thing I do know. I know for certain that when the people are dealing with runaway inflation at a 40-year high, a supply chain crisis, an energy crisis, with U.S. prestige and credibility at an all-time low on the world stage, with civil liberties under assault from seemingly all sides, with the streets festooned with poop and used needles, with little kids being forced to wear religious face coverings in the Marxist indoctrination factories that we used to call public schools, I know there is nothing foremost in the minds of the average U.S. voter except a riot that took place 1 year ago, which had no lasting effect on much of anything, the only real result of which was that the business of certifying the electoral vote count was delayed by a little over 2.5 hours. Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi, they think you care more about the January 6th insurrection than you do about the fact that their party has been running things for a little under 1 year now, and their policies have largely wrecked the country. When a party has spent the past year with control of the White House and both houses of Congress, they normally begin the midterm election year by highlighting all of their accomplishments and achievements from the past year. Well, that is, unless they don't have any. In which case, they'll try desperately to make the population focus on some event that happened before they were in charge. In other words, this maniacal obsession with the events of January 6th, it carries with it the tacit admission that they have failed at effectively governing the country, and they know they've failed, and they need some big, shiny object to distract your focus away from that failure. And try though they might, they will have an exceedingly difficult time succeeding in that distraction, because, spoiler alert, nobody who lives outside the Washington Beltway gives 2 squirts of piss about January 6th. And no amount of embarrassing histrionics is going to change that in any appreciable way. I don't think it would be possible for these people to appear any more out of touch with the everyday practical concerns of the people they're supposed to represent. And once upon a time, although it's almost certainly an apocryphal story, Emperor Nero famously played his fiddle while fire consumed the city of Rome and reduced it to cinders and ash, and because there is nothing new under the sun, especially in politics. Fast forward here to the year 2022, and while their hubris and incompetence reduced the country to a third world rubble mound, Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi think you can be bought off with celebrities singing show tunes on a Zoom call. That is what your ruling class thinks of your intelligence level and your priorities. So take that for what it's worth when you're casting your ballot this November. And that's it for me. Thank you very much indeed for watching. I hope your weekend's off to a pleasant start. I will be back on Monday. Until then, do not comply. Get off my lawn.